Dijkstra. I'm the director of the Center for Teaching and Learning at the University of Windsor.
And I'm Kay Johnson, Executive Director of Human Rights, Equity, and Accessibility at the University of Windsor.
Welcome, everyone. We're thrilled to have Dr. Wanda Thomas-Bernard join us to share resources for instructors to help them challenge anti-Black racism by building inclusive classrooms. And I'll turn it over to Kay for land acknowledgements and introductions.
Thank you, Erica. So the University of Windsor sits on the traditional territories of the Three Fires Confederacy, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. We also have a short version for the Afrocentric land acknowledgement, which is that as people of African descent, we offer this land acknowledgement in solidarity with the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island in the efforts and deliberate intentions towards decolonization. As people of African descent, we acknowledge the land of Turtle Island that sustains us, express deep gratitude to its Indigenous peoples, and pledge to honor our dignity and divinity that ultimately connects us all. So Dr. Wanda Thomas-Bernard is a professor emeritus in social work at Dalhousie University. Dr. Bernard is a highly regarded social worker, educator, researcher, community advocate, and activist, and advocate for social change. From 1990 to 2016, she was a professor at Dalhousie University School of Social Work, where she also served as director for a decade. A community-engaged scholar and an inclusive educator, she has a particular interest in transformative pedagogy. Dr. Bernard served as special advisor on diversity and inclusiveness at Dalhousie University, and she is the first African Nova Scotian to hold a tenure-track position at Dalhousie University and to be promoted full professor. Dr. Thomas-Bernard has received many honors for her work and community leadership, notably the Order of Nova Scotia and the Order of Canada. So welcome, Dr. Wanda Thomas-Bernard, and we look forward to this session. Thank you again for agreeing to join us today.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Erica and Kay, and for the very warm welcome. It's always a pleasure to engage with your faculty and staff at the University of Windsor.
Great, thank you. And so I have a first question for you is, as an educator, as an instructor, what context is helpful to be aware of when you are challenging anti-Black racism?
For educators who are trying to teach about and engage with issues around anti-Black racism, it's vitally important that people really unpack the layers of anti-Black racism. Sometimes people get hung up on looking at racism from a particular lens. We really want to encourage educators who are teaching this content to make sure they're focusing on individual racism, but also institutional racism, cultural racism, and systemic racism. And one of the things that people find very challenging is to turn the gaze on themselves. So when we're engaging in education around anti-Black racism, we need to look at the institution of education itself. And I encourage educators to begin there. Look at the institution that you're working within yourselves. And part of that work also needs to be centered on the experiences of those who experience anti-Black racism. So part of that experience, again, is that individual level of racism, but it's also systemic racism. It's also the racist stereotyping and microaggressions. And sometimes people tend to dismiss the microaggressions, but they're part of the reality. They're part of the experience. And one of the things that we've been identifying, that's been identified in the literature, is that racism does indeed cause trauma, multi-generational trauma, that racism is indeed a form of violence, and so we must treat it as such. But the other part of the equation that we sometimes lose sight of is around resilience. The notion of rising above, fighting against the anti-Black racism, and the word that or the phrase that we often use to talk about that is still we rise. Still we rise. So these are the ways in which I think instructors, faculty members need to begin to situate themselves, to set that broader context for this work. So part of that work also needs to be embedded in understanding the historical context of anti-Black racism, the very foundation on which it's built. And specifically in this country, I think there's a tendency, again, as a tendency to look to our neighbors to the south and talk about anti-Black racism in the United States. But we need to look at the historical context of anti-Black racism in Canada. Part of that context, of course, is the legacy of slavery. Part of that context is the ways in which, even after slavery was abolished, the ways in which the marginalization of people of African descent and the lack of access to things that people take for granted, lack of access to things like education, health, lack of access to employment and housing, and how those things all have an impact on the experiences of African Canadians, but also on the ways in which anti-Black racism is practiced in our everyday. I was saying earlier, let's start by looking at education, and one of the ways in which we see anti-Black racism then having a significant impact would be the underrepresentation of African Canadians in post-secondary education at all levels. So we're talking about students. We're also talking, though, about who the faculty are, who the staff are, who the administrators are, who the boards of governors are within our institutions. So we see this underrepresentation at all of those levels. So the issues of access and inequity really permeates the post-secondary education institutions in this country from coast to coast to coast.
This is really good context to have. How can you approach this in the classroom?
That's a really good question, and I think one that educators really grapple with, but it's one that I've really enjoyed in my career. When we think about post-secondary classrooms, we need to think about what we're teaching. So the content, who's represented in our curricula, and more importantly, who's absent. So the what we teach becomes really critical in all subjects. I've had people over the years ask me, well, how do you do this in science? Yes, you can bring a lens of and a perspective and a theory of anti-Black racism to the teaching of science as well as social sciences, all of our courses. So we all need to think about the what we're teaching. How do we bring equity and diversity and issues of anti-Black racism into the what we're teaching? But it's also about how we teach. That's critically important as well, because we need to attend to the diversity of who our students are and different learning styles, different learning needs. So how we present the content that we're teaching is very important. So paying attention to that and finding ways to do it well. Being very aware of who we are teaching. So who's in our classrooms. And also thinking about the work that they will do and the communities of people, our students who become our graduates, who will they be interacting with, interfacing with? So part of the what we're teaching and the how we're teaching needs to also include an emphasis on who we're teaching and how we pay attention to the needs of all of our students. And one of the things that I think is probably one of the best tools that we have as educators, particularly around this work, is thinking about how we use critical moments or critical incidents as teachable moments. I think that's really, really important. Taking the critical moments and using those as teachable moments. So where do you find these critical incidents or these critical moments? Can be from the media, can be from things that are happening around us, happening to us, can be things that are happening right in our university, or there could be things that are happening right in the classroom as we speak and teach and breathe. So I'll give you an example. As an example, sometimes we hear language that's racist or offensive in some other way. Do we just continue on with the teaching, or do we pause and deal with it in the moment? In my early years of teaching, I would just carry on. But I soon realized that that was not helpful, that pausing and dealing with things as they happen are very beneficial learning experiences for our students. Early in my career, I was introduced to bell hooks. And one of her many books that had the most significant impact on my teaching is actually the book Teaching to Transgress, Education as the Practice of Freedom, which was published in 1994. So this was early in my academic career. And when I discovered and read this book, it was so significant to my journey. Bell hooks, many of you will know, died in December of 2021. And this was probably one of the best legacies that she's left to educators in the world. But a few points from her work that I want to highlight here in response to your question. First of all, students can and do become marginalized in our classrooms. So we need to pay attention to that and address that. Teachers, educators can and must act to transform those spaces into inclusive spaces for all of our students. So how do we do that? And part of that work is so central to teaching from that perspective around anti-Black racism. Bell Hooks says that critical and engaged pedagogy is key to transformative classrooms. So if we're really trying to transform our classrooms, we need to be really engaged in a way and bring that critical lens to all of our work, to the what we're teaching, but also the how we're teaching. Very, very important to this journey. But one of the things, again, that Bell Hooks says is that the classroom continues to be the most radical space of possibility in the academy. There's so much that we can do. And as an educator, one of the things that I enjoy most is seeing students take up that radical space of possibility, pick up the torch and carry it forward. I find it transformative when I see that transformation happening with our students. And then transformative classrooms help us to realize this notion that Bell Hooks talks about, education as the practice of freedom. So if we think about education as the practice of freedom, that's possible because we're transforming our classrooms. That's possible because we're committed to a critical and engaged pedagogy where we're working with and including all of our students in that work.
This is powerful. Are there overall questions that can guide us in designing these inclusive curricula?
When we're thinking about inclusive curricula and how do we sort of do that kind of engaging, I think we need to start with the who is teaching. So who are we as educators, centering ourselves in that work? But it's also about who is learning. So who are the learners? Who are the students in our classroom that we're trying to engage? We need to ask the question around what is being taught. And we also need to ask the question about how. How are we doing that teaching?
Excellent. So earlier when we were talking, you mentioned it was important to center yourself. What are the questions people might ask themselves?
I love that question, because sometimes when educators are in the front of the classroom, they forget that they're an instrument as well in this work around teaching to transgress. So when we're talking about centering ourselves in the curricular design, we need to ask ourselves some questions. So I'll throw these questions out, like the who are you? So when you see yourself as an educator, who are you? What motivates you to actively engage in transformative pedagogy? Some people would run miles from this. Some people would not want to do this. What motivates you to do this work? What have you learned most about yourself through teaching with a critical lens? When we teach from a critical perspective, we do learn things about ourselves, and sometimes we learn things about ourselves that we're not happy with. For example, we may uncover biases. So my next question would be, what biases do you hold that prevent or block you from fully engaging in transformative pedagogy? There are so many biases that can hold us back. And biases are a part of our lives from the beginning, and certainly part of our work as educators. So how do we unpack and uncover those biases? When we're talking about centering ourselves in this work, part of that work needs to be about unpacking those biases. One of the things that really holds people back is fear. So I would ask the question, what fears do you have when you consider teaching to transgress? More and more now, there's pressure on universities across the country. I would say since the heightened awareness around truth and reconciliation, and also heightened awareness around anti-Black racism following the murder of George Floyd. There's been, I think, a greater attention to the need for more transformative and critical pedagogy in our universities. But some people are really afraid. So I would ask, what fears do you have when you consider teaching to transgress? When you think about yourself and try to center yourself in this work, what fears creep into your subconscious or maybe into your conscious mind? As a white educator, how does talking about whiteness make you feel? As an educator of privilege, no matter what privilege it is that you hold, how does talking about privilege make you feel? More importantly, what do you do about it? And then bringing this home to the focus of this session on anti-Black racism, how does talking about anti-Black racism make you feel? Some people don't even want to accept the reality that anti-Black racism is something real that we need to pay attention to in the academy. So how does talking about anti-Black racism make you feel? And you need to answer that question before you can teach about anti-Black racism.
You have started with self-awareness. How do you move from self-awareness to action?
I love that question. And I have an answer. I've created this AAA paradigm: awareness, analysis, and action. And I see this as an approach to challenging institutional racism. And I see it as a framework for social change. So if we think about awareness and move from there to analysis and then to action, I think it's a, no, I won't say I think. It's a framework that I've been using, I would say, for the past 20 years.
Thank you. Are there specific questions people can ask themselves for each step of this model?
I have some guided questions that can be used to help people get started, but I really want to encourage people to own this framework, shape it and build it into something that works for them. But I'll share with you some guided questions that I have found useful over the years. So if we start with awareness, and we're looking specifically at educators in post-secondary classrooms, one of the things I would say was when we're thinking about anti-Black racism in particular, what does this look like in your classroom? What is your knowledge of history and experiences of yourself, but also of students, the students who are coming into your classroom? Who are the students? Who's in your classroom? Who's not in your classroom? Who's missing? So looking at who's there, who isn't there. But part of that assessment, that awareness needs to be about what is being taught and how that teaching is being experienced by the students. What's their level of awareness in terms of this? Then when I think about analysis, one of the things that's really important is that we go through the 3 steps: awareness, analysis, and then action. I've been in some situations where we've gone from awareness to action. And when we miss the critical piece of analysis, we can make a lot of mistakes in the actions because the actions are not really integrated into an overall plan. And that plan comes from our deep analysis. So what is that analysis? What are some of the questions that need to be asked? Part of the questioning needs to be around the establishing a critical understanding of issues of power and privilege and oppression, and also empowerment, and how they operate in the classroom. So how are these issues experienced? Where do they land with your group of students, and how do you do further engagement with them? A critical review of what is taught and how it's being taught. That ongoing analysis of curricula needs to be considered. Looking at the content, what is being taught. Who is privileged in your syllabus? I don't think educators in post-secondary institutions pay enough attention to this. And many use the same syllabus year after year without looking at what new content is coming in, without looking at what perspectives are coming in, without considering the lens from which the content that you've included in your syllabus is actually where it's located. But it's also doing a critical analysis of how all of these realities in your classroom, how they impact the students' experiences, and how the impact will be different for different students. And how do you account for that in the classroom? How do these impact relationships between students? How do these impact relationships between students and the instructor? And how do they impact relationships between students and their broader relationship with the university itself? Our responses to those questions and many others that may come to mind, depending on the particular situation you're trying to deal with, would be leading us then to actions. And the actions are going to be different depending on the issues that you're dealing with. But broadly speaking, we should be asking questions like, who's responsible for leading the change you want to see in your classroom? Who's responsible? So is it the teacher, the educator, who's responsible for leading the change you want to see? And then if so, how do you bring students into those actions with you? Thinking about educators as educational leaders, how will your educational leadership lead to change? So the actions you take as an educator are going to have an impact on actions that your students take when they go out into the world in their respective fields. So thinking that through, thinking that leadership piece through. We tend to think about actions as personal or individual actions, and certainly we need to ask the question what personal actions are needed to bring about changes to make your classroom, how do you make your classrooms braver spaces? So yes, there are some personal actions. We also need to be thinking about the professional actions, what professional actions are needed, but what institutional actions are needed to bring about changes. I think about some of the work that I've done in university over the years and sort of thinking about the work done in the classroom, and that may have had a particular place, but if that work wasn't also supported by the unit and not supported by the university, then it's not going very far. And so how do you bring those actions to institutions? So it's personal actions, what personal actions are needed to bring about change in your classrooms, but what institutional actions are needed to bring about change to make the universities braver, safer spaces for all of our students. So those are some questions that I think would help people get started.
Many people ask us about lessons learned. In your experience, what are some critical elements for designing your course?
To educators, I would say that we always have to remember that you're an instrument. You are the instrument of transformative change in your classrooms. So for as much as we talk about the need for institutional change to be happening, you could have all of the institutional changes, but if there isn't that change happening at the classroom level, it's not going to be as effective or as powerful. So you as an educator, you are an important instrument in the transformative change process. Your course materials, so the curricula, really needs to reflect a variety of diverse perspectives on the chosen topics. And expect criticism around that, but you do need to include that diversity in the curricula. Sometimes educators choose to include materials that they know are offensive, that they know are discriminatory. But I really question the value of that. So in my experience, I would say that you should not include materials that contain offensive or discriminatory ideas, except to educate students about discrimination, oppression, or education, or to educate about other existing perspectives. And for me, that's a very strong line to draw in the sand, except to educate students. And there's some offensive content that I think just doesn't hold value in terms of educational value, in terms of educating students. So what an example of that I would give would be materials that contain the N-word. And some people still teach some of that content that has a lot of the N-word. And the argument that's often made is, well, that book or that resource has such relevance, such rich content, but the damage that it causes far outweighs. As instructors, when we're designing our curricula, we need to pay very close attention to that. And if we use the AAA paradigm, the awareness, the analysis, the action would be the choice you make in terms of what's in and what's out. And your analysis really needs to weigh all sides of the equation and to be thinking about not just the what's being taught, but who you're teaching and the impact that what you're teaching will have on every student in your classroom. And of course, accessibility is very important. So all course materials should be universally accessible. So that accessibility becomes a critical piece here. And we need to be thinking about, and again, this is going to be different depending on what program content you're teaching in. But you want to make sure that irregardless of the discipline, the subject matter being taught, you want to make sure that you're including specific things that help to create a more inclusive and transformative learning environment. So how do you do that? I cannot tell you the number of times I've heard students say to me just how students of African descent who feel so empowered when they see themselves in the curriculum, and how disempowering it is when they're totally excluded, and how disempowered and disengaged they feel when they're excluded. The other part of that question, I would say, in my experience, assignments are very, very challenging, because we have to do this. I would love to be able to teach and not offer any assignments, or if I offered assignments, not grade them. But that's not happening anytime soon. So here are some suggestions I have around assignments. I think that if we can create assignments that reflect a variety of diverse learning styles and needs, that would be really helpful. And be creative. I remember the first time I used a living library as a part of an assignment. I didn't know how it was going to land with students, and most students loved it. So be creative. It's okay to be creative. Assignments should engage and challenge students to critically reflect on what they have learned. So you don't want people just giving back everything that you've given to them. You want them to be able to apply what they've learned. So finding ways, having the assignment create space for students to be able to do that. And as much as possible, I encourage people, and when we're teaching and trying to bring in anti-Black racism's perspective into our teaching, I think assignments should link to real world experiences as much as that is possible. For example, one of the things that I often teach around in this content is human rights tribunals. They're public. And most people who go through a human rights tribunal do so because they want not just an outcome, a positive outcome for themselves, but they also want it to prevent whatever happened to them. We want to prevent that from happening to other people. Most people don't read human rights tribunals, but it's a wonderful teaching tool. I've been using it for years, and it's very, very effective. Another a tool that I have found really, really effective in terms of real world experiences now with social media, having students do assignments that somehow link them to what's happening on social media, again, is another really important a positive tool that I have found around assignments. And where this is possible, create or encourage opportunities for self-assessment or self-directed learning activities. For example, there's some literature around contract grading. How do we engage people in contract grading? And how do you do that in a way that students are more engaged and more empowered in their own learning? And how does that help to transform the curricula?
Great, thank you. So
Okay.
Are there closing or guiding questions, almost like a checklist, that might help broaden our practice when creating an inclusive classroom?
Yes, Kay, thanks for that question. I think there are some guiding questions that could help us, that could be top of mind as we're working hard to create more inclusive classrooms. One of the first questions I would ask is there a variety of diverse perspectives on the course topics? So when you're looking at that syllabus and you're looking at the number of topics you'll be using over the period of time, 12 weeks, most courses are, is there a variety of diverse perspectives being presented to the students? Are there any offensive or discriminatory ideas that may not truly educate students? Take them out. I want to be unapologetic about that. if you cannot firmly stand on the educational value that you think this holds, take it out. Are the course materials universally accessible? I think those are questions we need to be asking. Is there enough specific content that help to create an inclusive and transformative learning environment? So have you drilled down enough? Have you included enough specific content that's going to help that diversity of students? But we want to focus on inclusion, and we want to focus on transformation. Do you have enough there? Then the assignments. Do the assignments reflect diverse learning styles, reflect diverse learning needs? Do the assignments line up with the content that's been taught? Do the assignments effectively engage and challenge students to critically reflect on what they've learned, but also to think about how they turn that learning into action as they go forward in their respective fields?
This has been excellent. Are there any final thoughts for us for takeaway?
I think there are 3 takeaway messages that I'd like to encourage those who are viewing this podcast to think about. I'd like to remind faculty that you are indeed an instrument of institutional change, as well as individual change that you will bring to your classrooms. I want to remind you that critical pedagogy will bring critical issues to our classrooms. So being prepared for those opportunities, those critical incidents that will come into the classroom, being prepared to work with those and not run from them. And finally, I want to say, to be a critically engaged educator, you have to be creative, and you will be vulnerable. So dare to be creative, dare to be vulnerable, and you will be the most critically engaged scholar that you know.
Thank you so much, Wanda. This has been amazing, very large issues, as well as very practical practices that each of us can take away and work on in our own context and in our own courses and our own disciplines. I can't thank you enough. It's been a real pleasure to work with you over the past workshops, and I know I will be using these resources in my own courses. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this privilege that I've had to reflect back on a teaching career that spans a few decades now. And when I think about that learning, it's wonderful to be at a time and place where I can share that with others.
Thank you very much.